So let's assume that you decided to start paying off debt, but you have multiple debts, and you're not sure which one you should pay off first. How would you go about making that decision? We're going to cover that in today's video. So to begin with, let's talk about the two primary ways people pay off debt. The first method we'll discuss is effective for people who get a strong sense of satisfaction from a quick victory as they set out to accomplish a goal like paying off debt. This first method is called the debt snowball, and using this approach, you start by paying off your smallest debt first, then your next to smallest, and so on until you paid off all of your debts. Now, using the debt snowball allows you to score quick victories, which may serve as a helpful emotional boost to propel you forward toward paying off more debts. Now, the other method is called the debt avalanche, and it prioritizes monetary or financial efficiency over the psychological boost you might get from paying off debts quickly. In the debt avalanche, you start by paying off your debt with the highest interest rate first, then you pay off the debt with the next highest interest rate, and so on until you're debt-free. If you prefer to prioritize the path that saves you the most money, then the debt avalanche is the way to go. Let's run through a quick example so you can see how these two methods of paying off debt compare. So suppose you have the debts that are listed on your screen and you've got $1,000 of cash each month that you can direct toward paying them off. You got a car loan with a balance of $10,000 and an interest rate of 8%, a student loan for $30,000 with an interest rate of 3.5%, and finally a credit card with a $15,000 balance and an interest rate of 18% annually. And you can see whether you choose the avalanche, the snowball, it impacts several things: which debt you pay off first, how long it takes to pay off all of your debts, and finally how much you actually end up repaying for the debt. So in the snowball, you're going to start with the car loan, then go to the credit card, then the student loan. It's going to take you 38 months to pay everything off, and you can see the total interest paid is around $5,800. But using the avalanche, you're going to start with the credit card, then go to the car loan, then finally the student loan. It's going to take you 37 months, but you're only going to pay $4,396 in interest. So in this example, you get your first debt paid off 6 months faster using the debt snowball method, but you'd save $1,386.28 in interest by using the debt avalanche and focus on your higher interest rates first. So also in this case, you'd have all of your debts paid off first using the debt avalanche, but the total amount of time it takes to pay off your debts could vary between the avalanche and the snowball based on the actual interest rate, the size of the debt, and how much cash you can direct toward your debts each month. One method, the snowball or the avalanche, is not necessarily faster than the other one all the time. Now personally, I'm a fan of whichever method is more likely to encourage you to pay off your debt. The debt avalanche is only more beneficial if you keep paying off your debt. So if you think you're more likely to stay on track using the snowball, then that's the route you should take. On the other hand, if it bothers you to pay more interest than you have to and you want the most mathematically optimal path, then you would want to use the avalanche. Now, I hope that math helps you understand your debt situation better, but debt retirement is not always as simple as just lining up your debts in a certain order and then paying them off one at a time. If you ignore the other facets of your financial life, you could liberate yourself from your debt only to experience regret that you weren't setting aside some of your money for saving and investing instead. And when you make financial plans, you should make it with your total financial picture in mind. Debt is just one component of that. So for example, what if you spent years paying off a mortgage and missed out on thousands of dollars in compounding interest that you'll never get back because you weren't saving and investing? That could be very disappointing, especially if your mortgage interest rate is considerably lower than the returns you could have been harvesting by investing instead. I don't want to be misunderstood. I love the idea of being debt-free, but it shouldn't come at the expense of your overall financial well-being. There is more to consider. And to help with that, I like to categorize debt a few different ways. First, let's talk about secured versus unsecured debts. And many debts are issued against collateral, like homes, cars, or boats that provide a safety net for the lender in case the borrower defaults on the loan. This is known as secured debt, and if the borrower fails to keep their end of the bargain, the lender can repossess the collateral and sell it to recoup the money they provided for the loan. Now, naturally, the opposite of this is unsecured debt. Unsecured debts don't have collateral. Credit cards, consumer loans, student loans are all examples of unsecured debt. Now, the reason this distinction is important is because unsecured debts will typically have higher interest rates than secured debts because unsecured debts place higher risk on the lender. Another way I like to categorize debt is to consider whether or not the loan is issued against an appreciating or depreciating asset. So a house is an example of an appreciating asset, while cars are a common example of a depreciating asset. Appreciating assets are typically safer for the borrower and the lender because they're collateralized, and the collateral is unlikely to be less valuable than it was when the loan originated. Depreciating assets, on the other hand, are riskier to borrow against because they lose value over time. The cars, for example, depreciate so rapidly that it's not unusual at all for the value of the car to fall below the amount of principal remaining on the car noter, leaving you upside down on the loan. So if you borrow a bunch of money to buy a car and decide to sell it later, you may have a difficult time recouping the money that you owe for the car loan. A house, on the other hand, is probably going to grow in value after you buy it, meaning that it'll always be worth more than the amount you borrowed against it. So next, if you take these concepts of secured debt versus unsecured debt and appreciating assets versus depreciating assets, and you put them into a visual cross-section, you can quickly see where the safer and more dangerous debts reside in sort of a heat map. I call this the 4 debt quadrants, and here's an example of what I'm talking about. The cooler zones at the bottom left of the graph indicate places that are relatively safe, while the hotter zones in the upper right represent riskier areas for debt that should be avoided. So if you have a debt in the secured appreciating quadrant, that bottom left corner, you should evaluate whether or not you really need to pay it off. Many times you'll be better off just carrying the debt until the loan matures because you can make more money investing your cash instead. So for example, the interest rate on my mortgage currently is 3.5%. I can also currently make 4.33% using the money market fund in my brokerage account. So I'm making 88 basis points more, or 88 hundredths of a percent more, just by directing cash into a very low risk investment, the money market fund, instead of paying off my mortgage early. Plus, if I ever need access to that cash, it will be much easier to liquidate the money market fund than it will be to liquidate part of my house. In this case, it clearly makes more sense for me to just carry the debt and invest instead. Let's talk more about evaluating whether or not you should carry debts or pay them off. Now, if you've followed my channel or website for very long, I hope you've seen the Next Dollar Roadmap. It's a 10-step plan for moving from negative or zero net worth all the way to financial independence. Now, milestone number 3 on the roadmap is paying off toxic debt, which I define as debt that has highly destructive financial characteristics because it's either risky or it has a very high interest rate, or both. Now, the debt quadrants we covered just a second ago do a sufficient job explaining the risk factors associated with debt, but evaluating the interest rate is somewhat more nuanced. Now, there's a couple different ways we can evaluate whether or not a debt is considered high interest. One is pretty quick, but not very precise. The other is a bit more surgical. The simple way is to evaluate your interest rate relative to your age. Now, using this method, I would consider an interest rate to be high if you're in your 20s and it's over 6%, or if you're in your 30s and it's over 5%, or if you're in your 40s and it's over 4%. If you want a quick and dirty, simple guideline to follow, this is sufficient, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend focusing all of your energy on paying off your mortgage based on this method alone. Now, the more precise way to evaluate interest rates is more complicated because it moves. Now, using this method, I'd compare the interest rate on your debt to the current Treasury yield for a T-bill note or something of a similar duration as the term of the debt. So for example, let's assume you have a car loan with an interest rate of 3.8% and there's 24 months left on the loan. Now, as I'm writing this, a 2-year Treasury note is selling at a yield of 4.26%. That means I could go buy a 2-year Treasury note and earn more interest with virtually no risk than I'll save by paying off the car note instead. Now, that's not a huge difference, but it provides a benchmark for the current cost of debt versus the interest rate you're actually paying. Since the car loan has a better rate than the low-risk bond, there isn't an urgent need to pay it off based on the interest rate alone because you're getting a great deal on the debt. Of course, in order to come out better off financially, you'll need to actually invest the money you would be using to pay off the debt. So if you spend it all, it's a moot point. Truthfully, this sort of evaluation is only valid if the ultimate choice you're making is between paying off debt or investing the money instead. Now, just sharing my own opinions on debt, I typically have a very conservative point of view when it comes to debt. If I could have caught you earlier, I would recommend or suggest that you avoid borrowing money for anything that won't appreciate in value. Now, arguably, mortgages and student loans are about the only debts that fit into this category for me. And even in the case of student loans, I would put some serious guardrails around how you borrow money for school. I don't even like borrowing money for cars, which I know is a bit unusual, but so are millionaires. Ultimately, what you need to understand is that debt is a tool, but it can be a dangerous one. More often than not, I see it misused. And when in doubt, use cash if you have a choice. Now, one other final note I'll make is regarding mortgages. If you have a mortgage that exceeds the high interest evaluation criteria I walked through earlier, I wouldn't necessarily pay off a mortgage based on that information alone. And the reason is mortgages take a long time and a lot of money to pay off. But nest eggs also take a lot of time and money to build. These two priorities are often in conflict with each other. If you're choosing between paying off a mortgage with a relatively high interest rate and investing for retirement, I would tend to lean toward investing. In the meantime, I'd also keep an eye on interest rates and refinance your mortgage if rates come down to the point where it'd actually be advantageous for you to do that. So to summarize everything we've covered step by step, first, identify the debts that are toxic or severely hindering you financially using the debt quadrants and the high interest evaluation method I covered earlier. Second step is to pay off those debts using either debt avalanche or debt snowball, whichever method you prefer. And finally, number 3, once your debts are gone, direct your extra cash toward investing for retirement. Or you could jump over to milestone number 4 in the Next Dollar Roadmap. I'll put a link to it above, also in the description below. Now, for more about paying off debt or investing or really anything else financial, please check out our website. That's martinmoney.com, or keep watching this YouTube channel. As always, I'm grateful for your interest and time watching my videos. God bless and take care.